We ran through the streets, my breath sharp in my throat, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me, but it felt like the world was closing in. Maxine was ahead, leading us through the maze of alleys, her movements quick and sure. Isaac was right behind me, Clara just a few steps away. We had rehearsed this, we had prepared, but nothing could ever truly ready you for the panic that comes when it all starts to unravel. The distant sound of sirens mixed with the angry cries of the crowd behind us. The shots had stopped, but the tension didn't fade. There were no safe spaces now, only places to hide, to escape, to survive. "Turn left here," Maxine called out, her voice sharp, commanding. We ducked into a narrow alleyway, the walls closing in on either side, the dim light from the street lamps barely enough to see by. The sound of feet pounding the pavement echoed off the brick walls, as though the city itself was in pursuit of us. The rally, which had once felt like a swelling wave of hope, was now a chaotic mess of fear, anger, and violence. "Stay low, move fast," Maxine ordered, glancing over her shoulder. "They'll be searching the streets soon. We don't have much time." We followed, slipping through the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. It felt like we were in a different world, one where every corner held danger, and every passing second could bring a new threat. Clara's voice broke the silence. "The footage is out. It's already online. The media's picking it up." I nodded, trying to keep my breathing steady. The rush of adrenaline made everything feel disconnected, as if I were outside myself, watching it all unfold from a distance. But I couldn't let myself slip into that mindset. We had done what we came for. We had shown the truth. Now we had to survive long enough to see it make a difference. Maxine led us to a safe house, a rundown apartment on the edge of the city. The building was abandoned, the windows boarded up, the walls cracked and crumbling. But it was hidden, it was safe, at least for the moment. We slipped inside, closing the door behind us with a soft click. The room was small, sparse, nothing more than a few mattresses on the floor, a couple of chairs, and a table with an old laptop on it. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clara immediately moved to the table, pulling up the laptop and starting to type furiously. Isaac sat near the window, watching the streets below, his eyes constantly scanning, alert. Maxine collapsed onto the floor, her eyes closed for a moment, breathing deeply as if she was trying to ground herself after the chaos. "We did it," Clara said, her voice hoarse. "The video's gone viral. It's everywhere. The government can't control it." "But they'll try," Maxine replied, her voice low and dangerous. "They won't go down without a fight." Isaac turned from the window, his face grim. "We've got to be ready. They'll send more than just agents after us next time. They'll send everything they've got." Maxine's gaze hardened. "Let them come. We've been waiting for this." There was a pause, a heavy silence that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Then Clara turned to face us, her expression serious. "We've made a target of ourselves. The government won't just let us disappear. They'll come for us, but we can't stop now. Not after everything we've done. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep exposing the truth." Maxine stood, brushing dust off her jeans. "We keep fighting. But we need to move. We can't stay here long." Isaac nodded, grabbing his jacket and checking his gun one last time. "We've got a window. Let's make the most of it." The next few days were a blur of movement, of constant vigilance. We couldn't stay in one place for too long. We moved from safe house to safe house, never staying in any place long enough to be tracked. The government was tightening its grip on the city, and the crackdown was growing more brutal with each passing day. But even as the heat closed in around us, the fire that we had ignited continued to burn. Protests broke out across the country. The video Clara had sent to the media had gone global. People were talking, people were listening, and they were demanding answers. The truth was out there now, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Maxine was the first to speak it aloud. We need a larger plan, she said, her voice hard with determination. We've shown them the truth, but we've only scratched the surface. We need to take the next step. We need to hit them where it hurts. Clara was already on her laptop, pulling up encrypted channels, doing her best to stay one step ahead of the authorities. Isaac sat nearby, working on the logistics. But it was Maxine's vision that drove us now. We had the power of information, but we needed the means to amplify it. We'll hit their infrastructure, Maxine said, her eyes focused and clear. We'll expose their financial ties, their corporate backers. We need to take down the whole system, not just the people at the top. It's not just about revenge. It's about dismantling everything they've built. Every lie they've told. Clara paused, her fingers still on the keys. It's going to take time. It's going to take more than just us. I know, Maxine said. But it's the only way we win. As we prepared for the next phase of our fight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing at the edge of something even bigger than what we had already started. The world was changing. The government would try to stop us, to silence us, but we had already shown that we weren't afraid to fight back. And now, it was time to take that fight to the next level. The days felt like weeks as we moved through the city in the shadows, always looking over our shoulders, always one step ahead of the government's watchful eye. The tension between the movement we had sparked and the forces trying to crush us was reaching a breaking point. It was no longer just about staying hidden, it was about taking action. The network we had built, the connections we had made, was starting to work in our favor. Clara, working relentlessly, had gotten in touch with a group of hackers, people who had their own reasons for wanting to see the system fall. They were ready to help us, but they needed the right intel, the kind of information that would truly make a difference. Maxine was all business now. We no longer spoke of hope or ideals, but of strategy. The protests had escalated, but they were scattered, disorganized. It was time to give them direction. I've got a plan, Maxine said one morning, her voice steady but intense as we sat around the table. The protests are our leverage. We're going to synchronize them. Coordinate. We'll bring the city to a standstill. Isaac leaned forward, his brow furrowed. And what happens when they try to shut it down? They'll try, Maxine replied, but if we hit them where it hurts, they won't have enough manpower to stop us. We've already shown them how fragile their control is. We need to keep pushing, get them to overextend. Clara nodded. It's not just about the streets anymore. It's about hitting their corporate ties, their financial backing. We expose the money behind the violence. The plan was simple, but dangerous. We would leak information, data, communications, financial records. Everything. The public wouldn't just see the government's brutality, they'd see the people behind it, the corporations that funded the lies, the deals that kept the system in place. We were going to expose the truth, all of it, and we were going to make sure the world knew. The night before we launched the next phase of our operation, I couldn't sleep. The weight of what we were about to do pressed heavily on me. The stakes were higher than ever. If we failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for us, but for everyone who had come to believe in the cause. I stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The city stretched before me, lit by the faint glow of streetlights. It seemed so quiet, but I knew better. The calm was temporary. Tomorrow, everything would change. Maxine joined me after a while, standing silently beside me. You're thinking about it too much, she said softly. I can't help it, I replied. What if we're wrong? What if it's all just too much? She gave me a pointed look. If we don't do this, then we're not just fighting for change. We're fighting for survival. There's no going back, and you know that. But if we succeed, if we can bring them down, then we'll have done something that matters. I turned to face her, meeting her gaze. You really believe we can win, don't you? She nodded slowly. I do. We've already won more than they realize. The next day, we went to work. The streets erupted as the first protests began, coordinated to strike at the heart of the city's financial district. People flooded the streets, shutting down intersections, blocking entrances to major banks and corporate headquarters. The news began to pick up the coverage, but this time, it wasn't just the usual faces. This time, the people knew why they were there. They weren't just angry, they were fighting back against a system that had been rigged against them for far too long. And then came the leaks. Clara's team had done their job. They had infiltrated the financial systems, accessed records, and pulled out the connections that tied the government to the corporations behind the oppression. Every piece of information was like a blow to the system, each leak a reminder of how deep the corruption ran. The videos, the documents, the emails, everything was out in the open now. The truth was impossible to ignore. And then, the first blow landed. A major corporation, one of the key funders of the government's operations, came under fire. Their executives resigned in disgrace, their stock prices plummeted. The government scrambled, trying to contain the damage, but it was too late. The people had seen the truth. We had struck the first blow in a battle that had only just begun. But it wasn't over yet. The government, desperate to regain control, escalated their efforts. The next day, an order came down from the highest levels: curfew. Martial law. They were going to make sure the streets were empty. The crackdown was coming. Maxine's voice was grim when she addressed us. This is it. They're coming for us. They'll try to silence us, but we're not backing down. Isaac stood up, already gearing up. We need to go underground. They'll hit the media next. We've got to keep pushing, keep fighting. Clara was at the laptop, pulling up data, preparing for the next wave. We've got everything we need. We just need to move faster. That night, as we prepared to move once again, the realization hit me: this wasn't just about us anymore. This wasn't just about a group of people trying to expose the truth. This was about a movement, a shift in power. We had lit the spark, but the fire had spread far beyond what any of us had imagined. We were at the beginning of something huge, and we couldn't stop now. The fight was only going to get harder, but I knew one thing for sure: we weren't going to lose. Not now. Not when we had the truth on our side. The tipping point had come. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps and whispers as we moved swiftly through the shadows. The government had struck hard, using every tool at their disposal to regain control of the situation. The curfew had been enforced, but that didn't stop the protests. The streets were still filled with people, determined to have their voices heard. We had made it to the underground safe house, a place that Clara and the others had set up in case of emergencies. The concrete walls were cold, but the people inside were warm with resolve. This was it, there was no going back. The government's crackdown was in full swing, and they weren't going to stop until we were silenced. Maxine stood at the front of the room, her posture straight, her face etched with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "We're not just up against the government anymore," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "We're up against the entire system. The corporations, the media, the people who've been profiting from our suffering for years. And they're going to fight back harder than we ever imagined." Isaac paced back and forth, his hands clenched at his sides. "We've already exposed them. We've already hit them where it hurts. We can't stop now. We need to keep the pressure on." Clara was typing furiously at her laptop, scanning through encrypted files. She had been the one to set the next phase of the plan into motion, the one that would take us deeper into the heart of the beast. "I found something," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with excitement. "There's a hidden account, connected to some of the highest-ranking officials. It's a slush fund, Money used to finance everything from covert operations to bribing the media. Maxine's eyes narrowed. How much are we talking about? Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. Enough to make them fold. Enough to destroy everything they've built. I could feel the tension in the room tighten. This was the breakthrough we had been waiting for. With this information, we could expose not just the extent of the corruption, but the way it had been funded. It was time to take the fight directly to the heart of the system. The next day, we launched the leak. Clara had orchestrated the release of the financial records, and they hit the public like a bomb. The media scrambled to cover the story, but it wasn't just another scandal, it was the scandal. For the first time, the people saw just how deep the rot went. Television stations tried to cover the story, but the government, now fully aware of the impact the leaks were having, began issuing press conferences denouncing the information as lies. They used their influence over the media to try and spin the narrative back in their favor, but it was too late. The truth was out, and the people weren't buying the lies anymore. Protests erupted across the country, but this time, they were different. They weren't just isolated movements, they were unified. People from all walks of life, from all corners of the country, were flooding into the streets. The tipping point had come. But as the movement grew, so did the government's response. They had called in reinforcements, riot police, soldiers, and mercenaries hired by the corporations that were backing them. The streets were filled with armed forces, ready to do whatever it took to maintain order. We had known this would happen. We had anticipated the brutality, but there was no way to prepare for the sheer force they would unleash. The first clashes began at dawn, when soldiers surrounded key protest sites. They used tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition to disperse crowds, but the people fought back, throwing rocks, lighting barricades on fire, refusing to back down. I stood in the safe house, watching it all unfold on the screens in front of me. Clara had managed to tap into the live feeds from the streets, giving us a real-time look at the chaos. The protesters were holding their ground, but they were being outnumbered, outgunned. The military presence was overwhelming. Maxine turned to me. We have to make a choice. We can either sit here and wait for the inevitable, or we take the fight to them. We can't keep running. We've already exposed them. We've got the people behind us. If we wait too long, they'll crush us. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. The decision wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about survival. We fight back, I said, my voice steady despite the fear crawling in the back of my mind. We fight back with everything we've got. We moved quickly, gathering what little we had left, equipment, food, anything that could help us in the coming days. We knew that the government would be looking for us. The safe houses, the underground networks, none of them would be safe for much longer. It was time to go on the offensive. As we stepped out into the night, the city was alive with unrest. The air smelled of smoke, and the distant sounds of gunfire and shouting carried across the streets. We were walking into the heart of the storm, but there was no turning back now. We had gone too far to retreat. Maxine led the charge, her face set with a hard determination. Isaac and Clara were right behind her, each one ready for whatever came next. The streets were full of people fighting for their future, and we were a part of it now. We didn't know how long we had before the military descended on us, but we knew this, we weren't alone anymore. The movement was bigger than just us. It was bigger than any of us had ever imagined. As we crossed the city, heading toward the next target, the corporation that had funded the government's military response, I couldn't help but think of everything we had lost. But I also thought of everything we had gained. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The government thought they could crush us, but they were wrong. We weren't just a group of rebels anymore. We were a movement, and the people had spoken. The time for silence had passed. The time for action was now. The night was heavy with a sense of urgency. As we moved through the alleys and side streets, the sounds of distant chaos grew louder. The protests were no longer just a reaction to our leaks, they had evolved into a full-scale uprising. People from all walks of life had risen up, fueled by the same anger that had driven us to expose the corruption in the first place. But this wasn't just about the government anymore. It was about the people reclaiming their voices, their dignity, and their power. Maxine, Clara, Isaac, and I moved quickly, our footsteps almost inaudible in the thick night air. The city was a battlefield. It wasn't just the military on the streets anymore, it was the people, too. We could see them, some were armed, others were simply marching, chanting, and holding signs. Every few blocks, we would hear the pop of gunfire or the wail of sirens, but the people didn't back down. They couldn't. As we approached the heart of the city, the headquarters of the corporation that had been financing the government's response, Clara tapped me on the shoulder. She had her laptop out, eyes scanning the screen. "I've got the location," she said. "We're close." Isaac adjusted his jacket and pulled a mask over his face. "Time to make them pay," he muttered, his voice tight with resolve. There was no turning back now. The building ahead of us stood tall, an imposing fortress in the heart of the city. But we had one thing on our side, the people. We reached the building's perimeter, and Maxine motioned for us to stop. "This is it," she said. We breached through the back. "Clara, you're on overwatch. Isaac and I will take the main entrance. You cover us." Clara gave a sharp nod, her fingers already moving over the keyboard. "I'll give you the signal," she said, her voice calm despite the pressure. We split up. Maxine and Isaac moved swiftly toward the front of the building, while Clara and I made our way around to the back. The tension in the air was thick, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to do. This wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a declaration. We were going to hit them where it hurt, and we weren't going to stop until they understood that they couldn't control us anymore. Clara's voice crackled through my earpiece. "They're on high alert. Security's tightening up. You've got 2 minutes before they lock down the entire building. You've got to move fast." I glanced back at her, watching as she typed furiously on her laptop. Her focus was unshakable. Clara had always been the brain behind our operations, calculating, precise, and ruthless when it came to getting the job done. "We'll be in and out," I said, trying to steady my nerves. My hands felt clammy, but I pushed the fear down. This was the moment we had been working toward. Maxine and Isaac moved silently, disappearing into the shadows as they approached the front entrance. We weren't sure how much time we had before security realized something was wrong, but we couldn't afford to hesitate. Clara's voice came through again, sharp and clear. "Now. Go." I rushed forward, following Clara's instructions step by step. We breached the back entrance and slipped inside the building, the faint hum of machinery and the low murmur of voices surrounding us. We were in. Maxine and Isaac had already made their way inside through the front. The security team was in disarray, scrambling to understand what had just happened. They had never expected an attack from within. Clara's interference had bought us precious time, disabling the building's internal security systems for a few minutes. 2 floors up, Clara instructed, her voice steady as always. "There's a vault. You're looking for files, financial documents, names, anything that ties the corporation directly to the government's covert operations." We moved quickly, slipping past stunned employees and avoiding the few remaining guards. Every moment was critical. I could hear the pounding of my heart in my ears as we climbed the stairwell. We reached the 2nd floor, and Maxine signaled for us to stop. "Clear," she whispered. The hallway was dimly lit, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the far end. Isaac pressed his back to the wall, his hand ready on his weapon. "Let's go." We moved toward the vault, a massive steel door with a digital lock. Clara's voice was the only sound in our earpieces. I've got the code. Ready. Isaac didn't wait. He set to work, fingers flying over the keypad. There was a loud beep, followed by a hiss of air as the vault door slowly began to open. Inside, rows of files lined the shelves, each one a potential key to unraveling the corruption that had brought us to this point. Take everything, Maxine said, her voice low. Every file. Every piece of evidence. We moved swiftly, collecting everything that could expose the corporate government collusion. We didn't know what we'd find, but we knew this was the final blow. Once the people saw this, there would be no going back. As we exited the building, the sounds of protest outside had grown louder. The people had gathered in full force, marching toward the corporate headquarters. They were ready to burn it all down. Clara's voice broke through the tension. They know we're in there. You've got about 3 minutes before they lock everything down. Isaac turned to Maxine. We're not getting out the same way. Maxine nodded. We make a run for it. Stick together. Stay low. We moved fast, dodging between buildings and weaving through alleyways, the tension building with every step. We could hear the sirens now, faster, closer. The military was on its way. This wasn't going to be easy. But we had done it. We had the evidence. And the people were already rising. This was only the beginning. The streets were alive with movement, chaos and hope intertwined. It was a strange feeling to be in the midst of it all, knowing we had set the spark that ignited this wildfire. As we made our way through the city, the air was thick with anticipation. The people had taken to the streets in unprecedented numbers. What had started as a protest had now turned into a full-fledged revolution. Clara's voice crackled in my ear again. The files are secure. I've already started sending them to every major news outlet I could access. The government won't be able to contain this. It's over. Maxine turned to look at me, her face a mask of determination. They've got one more move left. We've taken their cards off the table, but we need to keep the pressure on. They'll come at us hard. We have to be ready. Isaac, always the pragmatist, was quieter than usual. We've got no time to wait for their next move. They'll come after us and everyone we've touched. We need to disappear, fast. I knew Isaac was right, but the weight of everything we'd just done, the leak, the chaos, was pressing on me. What had we started? Had we truly done the right thing? Every action had a consequence. People were losing their lives out there. I had seen it firsthand, the destruction that followed the first shots fired. But I also knew that we couldn't stop now. The truth was out, and the people would decide how to handle it. Clara's voice broke through my thoughts. We need to head to the drop zone. There's a safe house. We'll lay low until this blows over. I nodded, motioning for the others to follow. We had to keep moving. The plan was simple: get to the safe house, lay low, and wait for the storm to pass. But nothing had ever gone according to plan before. As we moved deeper into the city's heart, the sounds of the revolt became more intense. People weren't just protesting anymore, they were fighting. Barricades lined the streets, and fires burned in the distance. A few miles away, the heavy thud of military vehicles rolling into the city sent shockwaves through the crowds, but they didn't disperse. If anything, the people were only emboldened. Isaac led the way, cutting through alleyways with the precision of someone who had spent years running from danger. We couldn't trust the main roads anymore. They were being watched, and the closer we got to the drop zone, the more dangerous it became. Maxine kept her eyes peeled, scanning the surroundings for any sign of a tail. She had always been the most observant of us, nothing got past her. As we neared an abandoned building that was supposed to serve as our temporary refuge, I felt my anxiety rise. The safe house was supposed to be secure, but with everything that was happening, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the authorities zeroed in on it. We reached the building. The door was cracked slightly, a signal that it was safe. Inside, the space was dim, the air thick with dust and the smell of stale air. There were no windows, no way to see the world outside. It was the perfect place to hide, but that didn't make it feel any less like a trap. Clara moved to a corner of the room and began setting up her equipment, her fingers moving quickly over the controls. "I'm setting up a secure connection to the outside," she said. "We'll be able to monitor the situation. If they make any moves, we'll know." Isaac took a seat on the floor, resting his back against the wall. "We should rest while we can. They're coming for us." Maxine nodded, pulling a gun from her jacket and setting it on the table in front of her. "We have to be ready for anything." I sat down, my back against the cold concrete, my mind still spinning with everything we had just done. The files, what they contained, would change everything. The people would know the truth now, and they wouldn't stop until the system was dismantled. But even as the idea of victory burned in my chest, a nagging thought lingered. How much destruction would it take to bring about change? And who would be left standing once the dust settled? As hours passed, we heard the distant rumble of military vehicles, the low hum of helicopters above. They were scouring the city. They knew someone had breached the corporation's headquarters, and they were hunting for us. The authorities had already begun to crack down on the protests, turning them into riots. People were being detained, disappeared. Some were being shot on sight. But the people had grown relentless. They were no longer asking for change, they were demanding it. Clara stood up abruptly, her face tense. "It's happening. They've begun the crackdown. The military is moving in force. There's a curfew in place, and they're sending squads into the streets. If we don't move now, we'll be caught in the crossfire." Maxine stood, grabbing her weapon. "We don't run. We fight." Isaac clenched his jaw. "We're not going down without a plan. But we're not staying here either." I stood with them, my resolve hardening. We had made it this far, and we weren't going to back down. Not now. "Let's go," I said. "We take the fight to them. It's not over until we say it is." Clara looked at me, her eyes sharp. "You're sure about this?" "There's no turning back," I said. "We finish what we started." We gathered our things quickly and prepared to leave. As we made our way out into the night, the city was no longer a place I recognized. The streets, once familiar, were now unfamiliar battlegrounds. People were everywhere, fighting, marching, and refusing to back down. They were demanding justice, but at what cost? We could see the military closing in, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing in the distance. The fight was far from over. We had given them the truth. Now it was up to the people to decide how far they were willing to go to change the world. The city was alive with chaos. It wasn't just the sounds of protest anymore, it was the deafening roar of a revolution. Barricades had turned into fortresses, makeshift weapons glinting in the hands of citizens determined to overthrow the system. The air was thick with smoke, but it wasn't just from the fires burning in the streets, it was from the rage that had finally reached its boiling point. We moved through the city with purpose, staying low, cutting through alleyways and hidden paths. The safe house had been compromised within hours of us arriving. Someone must have tipped off the authorities. It wasn't just about our group anymore. It was about the survival of this revolution, the truth we had exposed. Clara's voice in my earpiece was sharp. "I've been monitoring the comms. The government has put out an all-points bulletin for us. They're tightening the perimeter. Every corner of the city is covered." Isaac's voice, steady as ever, came next. "We're not getting out this time. It's all or nothing." Maxine had remained silent, her expression grim. She was always calculating, always thinking ahead, but I could see it in her eyes, the weight of the decision that had been made. We couldn't turn back now. We had made our way to the heart of the city, an area once bustling with life, now eerily quiet, save for the faint murmur of the crowd still gathered in the streets, chanting and demanding change. We knew the military would soon arrive, and with them, the full force of the government's wrath. But we couldn't let them erase everything we had worked for. The plan was simple: we would hijack the government's own broadcast system. If we couldn't get away, at least the truth would reach the masses. "We'll split up," I said, looking at each of them. "Maxine and Isaac, you take the north side. Clara, you're with me. We'll breach the signal station. We're running out of time." Maxine didn't hesitate. "Let's make it quick." The streets were a battleground now. The sounds of gunfire were constant, but we kept moving, blending into the crowds when we could, and slipping into shadows when we had to. We were getting close. As we neared the broadcast station, Clara checked the small device she had been carrying. "We're close. But the signal is locked down. It's gonna take a few minutes to crack their system." I glanced around. "We don't have a few minutes." Clara nodded, her fingers flying across the device. "I can bypass their firewalls, but I need cover." Maxine's voice crackled in my earpiece. "We've got trouble on our side. We're pinned down. It's a full assault." Isaac's voice followed. "We're not going anywhere. If we go down, we're taking them with us." The urgency in his words hit me. The plan was never going to be clean. There was no escaping this. "Clara, you've got to move faster," I urged. She nodded but didn't look up. She was in the zone, her face lit by the glow of her device as she worked. I could see her lips moving silently, calculating, as she fought against the government's best tech. I turned my attention back to the street. The first military vehicles began to roll into view. Armored trucks, soldiers spilling into the streets, their weapons raised, ready to clear the area. We couldn't hold them off for long. Isaac's voice came through again, strained this time. "Maxine and I are outnumbered. We can't keep them back much longer." I felt the weight of the decision pressing on me. We couldn't afford to fail now, not after everything. "Clara, I need you to finish this." "I'll keep them off you," I said, drawing my weapon. Clara's eyes flicked to me, her brow furrowed. "What are you?" "I'm buying you time," I said, cutting her off. "Do it. Now." I stepped out into the open, facing the oncoming soldiers. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no turning back now. The roar of the crowd faded into the background as I raised my weapon and took a deep breath. The first shot rang out. I dove behind a concrete pillar, narrowly avoiding the blast. The sounds of gunfire filled the air, but I kept my focus. I couldn't let them get through. Not until Clara had finished what we started. Time seemed to stretch as the chaos intensified. Clara's fingers never stopped moving over her device, her eyes locked on the screen. Every few seconds, I could hear her muttering to herself, calculating, trying to unlock the final piece of the government system. The enemy was closing in on us, but I kept firing, picking off soldiers one by one as they charged. Maxine and Isaac were still fighting on the north side, their voices growing more frantic in my earpiece. They were running out of options, but we were in too deep to stop now. It felt like an eternity, but then, Clara's voice broke through the tension. "I'm in. The signal is ours." I didn't hesitate. "Broadcast it." A few seconds later, the sound of a loudspeaker crackled to life. It was a voice, our voice. It was raw and unfiltered, the truth spilling out over the airwaves. "The truth has been hidden from you, but no longer," I said, my voice loud and clear. "The government, the corporations, everyone who has lied to you for decades, they will fall. This revolution is just beginning. We will not stop until we are free." The sounds of gunfire were louder now, and I could see the soldiers closing in, their faces grim and determined. But the truth had been broadcasted. People were already hearing it, and I knew that no matter what happened to us, the message would live on. Maxine's voice came through the earpiece one last time. "We're out of options. They're everywhere." Isaac added, his tone resigned but resolute, "It's been an honor. We fight until the end." I felt the sting of tears in my eyes but wiped them away. It's not over. It's just the beginning. As the military surrounded us, I took one last look at Clara. Her face was streaked with sweat, her hands shaking but still holding firm to the device. She had done it. We had done it. The battle raged on, but the revolution had been ignited. We had given the world the truth. Now, it was up to them to finish it. The city that had once been a symbol of order and control had now become the epicenter of something much larger, a revolution that no one could stop, not even the powerful forces that had tried to suppress it. The broadcast we had triggered rippled across the nation like a shockwave, igniting flames of resistance in every corner of the country. People who had been silent for far too long now found their voices. The truth, raw and unflinching, had been unleashed, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything in its path. The government's response was swift, but it was too late. Martial law was declared, and the military began tightening their grip. But it wasn't enough. People who had once feared the consequences of speaking out were now marching in the streets, demanding accountability, justice, and an end to the corruption that had plagued their lives for generations. It was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. But for me, it was personal. We had lost so much already. The lives we had sacrificed, the friendships broken, and the toll it had taken on our bodies and minds, it was all leading to this moment. But even as I watched the streets erupt in chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The hardest part was yet to come. I woke up to the sound of shuffling feet and whispers. For a moment, I thought I was back in that old safe house, but when I opened my eyes, I saw only darkness. My head throbbed, and I instinctively reached up to touch the wound on my temple, the one that had bled out during the final assault. I was in some sort of underground bunker now, the air thick with tension. I could hear voices, low and muffled. It took me a moment to piece together where I was, one of the rebel hideouts we had set up, a place to regroup after the storm. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my body, and I collapsed back onto the cot. "Easy, easy," came a voice, and I recognized it immediately. Clara was kneeling beside me, her eyes wide with concern. "You're safe. For now." I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The room was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles and the dull glow of screens, filled with maps and intel reports scattered across the table. There were others in the room, too, moving quietly, more members of the underground network. But one face stood out among them, Maxine. Maxine was standing near the door, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Isaac was beside her, his face drawn and tired, but alive. We had made it out, though I couldn't figure out how. "How long have I been out?" I asked, my voice rough, as I attempted to sit up again. Clara helped me steady myself. "A few days. You lost a lot of blood. We had to move quickly, and the military was on our tail the entire time. We had to split up after the broadcast went live. Maxine and Isaac managed to get us here." I turned to Maxine. "And the others? What happened to the others?" Maxine's gaze softened for a brief moment before hardening again. "We lost a lot of people in that final push. The government hit us harder than we expected, and the military is sweeping the city. But we still have pockets of resistance. We're regrouping." Isaac stepped forward, his expression grim. "The military is cracking down harder than we thought. They've got informants everywhere. But the broadcast, it's done its job. People are waking up. The system is falling apart." I nodded, my mind still racing. The message had been heard, and the ripple effect had started. But we weren't out of danger yet. The government had resources, manpower, and they weren't going to give up so easily. They would come for us, no matter where we hid. Where do we go from here? I asked, looking at Clara, Maxine, and Isaac. They were the ones I trusted to lead us forward, and their decision would determine the next chapter of this fight. Maxine was the first to speak, her voice steady but weary. We can't stay here for long. We'll need to keep moving. But there's a resistance cell in the south we could join up with. They've got a better network in place, and they've been planning an assault on one of the government's key facilities. Clara's voice was quieter but firm. We need to gather more intel, maybe even make contact with other cells. If we go in without the right information, we'll be walking into a trap. We can't afford to make another mistake. I rubbed my temple, still trying to piece together everything. We had no time to waste, but I knew Clara was right. We couldn't rush into another confrontation without solid intel. The government would be expecting us to make a move soon. We'll give it a few more days to gather intel, then we move, I said, deciding that we needed to act but with caution. We can't let them corner us. If we wait too long, they'll have us boxed in. The days passed in a blur of planning, strategizing, and moving between safe houses. Clara's skill with tech had proven invaluable as she cracked government communications and fed us information from the inside. Maxine worked tirelessly with the resistance, setting up new supply lines, while Isaac coordinated with the scattered cells of the revolution. Every moment felt like a battle for survival, but we were all in this together. The tension was palpable. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the revolution had taken on a life of its own. More cities were erupting into protest, the streets filling with people demanding change. The government responded with violence, but it only fueled the flames. The nation was on the brink, and the weight of that knowledge was both a burden and a source of hope. But even as the revolution spread, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The government wouldn't go down without a fight, and there were more powerful forces at play than just the military. They would stop at nothing to crush us, and to crush the truth we had exposed. And we weren't ready to lose yet. The underground network we had established was growing, but so was the enemy's power. The government had begun to tighten its grip on every city, every town, every street. The military patrolled the neighborhoods, hunting down dissenters, silencing those who dared speak out. It felt like a storm was coming, a tempest that would either break us or make us stronger. We moved swiftly from one location to the next, never staying too long in one place. We couldn't risk being caught off guard again. Each safe house became a temporary refuge, a fleeting sanctuary, and even as we set our sights on the next target, we were aware that we were running out of time. The resistance cells we were in contact with were being systematically dismantled. We had to act fast before the government crushed everything we had worked for. Clara was the first to realize how far the enemy's reach extended. One of her informants inside the government had passed along unsettling news. High-level officials had begun organizing covert operations to infiltrate our ranks. They were targeting anyone who might have had direct contact with the broadcast or any of the leaders of the rebellion. People we trusted were being turned. Friends were becoming foes. Maxine, Clara said one evening, her voice low and tense as she approached her. I need to talk to you. Maxine looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. What's going on? We've got a problem. Someone's been feeding the government information from inside our network, Clara said, her face darkening with concern. One of my sources just gave me a name. They're trying to find out who was behind the broadcast and track down the leadership. Maxine's jaw clenched. How bad is it? Bad enough that we're all at risk. If we don't take care of it soon, we're going to lose everything. Maxine stood up, pacing across the room, her fingers running through her short, cropped hair. This isn't good. We've been careful, but the government's better funded, better equipped. They know how to get under our skin. We've got to find out who's responsible for this leak, and fast. I stood up, walking toward them. We can't waste time. Whoever's behind this needs to be dealt with, or we're all dead. We've already lost too much. Clara nodded, and I could see the determination in her eyes. This wasn't just about the revolution anymore. It was personal. Every time we moved, every time we trusted someone new, we risked it all. The betrayal was closer than we realized. That night, Clara stayed up late, working on a strategy to pinpoint the mole. She had already started cross-referencing all the communications, tracing any irregular patterns, any inconsistencies. Her mind worked like a razor-sharp blade, cutting through the noise to find the truth. But even with all her skills, I could see the toll it was taking on her. The weight of leadership was heavy, and the pressure to protect the ones she loved was suffocating. Maxine, meanwhile, was preparing for the worst. She knew that in a situation like this, trust was a luxury we couldn't afford. If there was a traitor among us, they could be anyone. A friendly face, a trusted ally, someone who knew our movements, our plans. The very thought of it made my blood run cold. Isaac was silent most of the time, as usual, but even he seemed rattled. The tension was palpable. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. We were fighting an enemy that knew how to play dirty, how to wear us down until we cracked. The following morning, as we gathered in the makeshift war room, Clara delivered the news. "I found it," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "The leak. It's coming from someone within the second-tier network. I've cross-checked the logs. A few people we thought we could trust have been sending messages to government handlers." Maxine's eyes narrowed, her fists clenched at her sides. "Who?" Clara hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "It's Anna." I froze. Anna was one of the first people I had recruited. She had been with us from the beginning, working alongside us to build the rebellion from the ground up. She was one of the few I had trusted implicitly. But now, hearing her name as the traitor, the one who had been feeding the government information, it shattered everything I thought I knew. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice strained. "There must be some mistake." Anna wouldn't. Clara held up a hand, her face grim. "I've triple-checked it. The pattern matches. She's been feeding intel to government contacts for weeks. She's been playing both sides." Maxine was already moving toward the door. "Then we take care of it. No more hesitation." "Wait," I said, holding up a hand to stop her. "We can't just confront her like this. We need to be sure. If we rush in without all the facts, we could make a bigger mistake. Anna's one of us. We owe it to her to find out why she did it." Clara nodded in agreement. "We need a plan. We can't just go in guns blazing. But we also can't let her continue to undermine everything we've worked for." The decision was made. We would confront Anna, but not with the raw force Maxine suggested. We would track her down, corner her, and make her face the consequences of her actions, on our terms. If she had betrayed us, she would answer for it. If she had been coerced, manipulated, or worse, we would figure it out. But no matter what, we couldn't let this betrayal go unchecked. As we set the plan into motion, I felt the weight of the revolution pressing down on me. We had come this far, but every step we took brought new risks, new dangers. The stakes were higher than ever, and the line between friend and enemy was growing thinner by the day. We couldn't afford any more mistakes. Not when everything we had fought for was on the line. The plan was simple: meet Anna in a quiet, secluded location where we could confront her without attracting unwanted attention. We had no time to waste. If Anna was indeed the traitor, then we couldn't let her lead the government to the heart of our operations. But if she wasn't, we needed to make sure she wasn't in danger or being manipulated. Maxine, Clara, and I made our way to the location in silence. The weight of the task ahead was heavy, each of us deep in thought. What if we were wrong? What if Anna wasn't the one leaking information? But the evidence was overwhelming. Clara's research had been thorough, and there was no denying the pattern. The sun was setting as we approached the old warehouse, the shadows growing longer as we neared the entrance. The air was thick with tension. I glanced over at Maxine, her face set in stone, her eyes hard. Clara was focused, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her movements efficient. We had to move quickly. As we entered the warehouse, I felt a chill in the air. The smell of damp concrete mixed with the scent of oil and metal. Anna was already there, standing near the back of the warehouse, her arms crossed, her posture guarded. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she was wearing the same worn jacket she had worn when we first met. But today, there was something different about her. Something that made her seem colder, distant. I took a step forward, my voice steady but tense. "Anna, we need to talk." She didn't flinch, didn't even move. Her eyes flicked to mine, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, a fleeting memory of the bond we had shared when we fought together for a common cause. But it quickly disappeared, replaced by the coldness of a stranger. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice flat. Clara stepped up beside me, her expression unwavering. "We know what you've been doing, Anna. The government's been getting information from you." Anna's gaze hardened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, a deep, resigned sound, and uncrossed her arms. "You don't understand," she said softly. "You never did." Maxine's voice was sharp as she spoke, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? You've been working with the enemy, Anna. You've been feeding them everything. You've put us all in danger." Anna's eyes flicked toward the floor, then back up at us. "I didn't want to. But they know everything about me. My family. My life. If I didn't give them information, they'd kill them all. I was trying to protect them." I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't what I had expected. This wasn't the Anna I had known, the one who had stood beside me through thick and thin. The thought that she had been forced into this position, that her betrayal was out of fear, not malice, hit me harder than I expected. "I didn't have a choice," she continued, her voice trembling now. "They've been watching me. I tried to find another way, but I couldn't. I was too deep in, and they made sure of that. If I didn't comply, they would have killed everyone I loved." Clara's gaze softened just a little, but the fire in her eyes remained. "That doesn't excuse what you did, Anna. We've all made sacrifices for this cause. We've all put ourselves in danger for the fight. You could have come to us. We would have protected you." Anna shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "You don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to be completely alone, to have nothing left but fear. They made sure I couldn't go to anyone. They made sure that if I ever stepped out of line, it wouldn't just be my life on the line." I stepped forward, my voice soft but firm. "We could have found a way. We always find a way. Betrayal, no matter the reason, still damages the trust we've built. But if you're truly sorry, if you truly didn't have a choice, then help us now. Help us fight back." Anna looked at me, her expression tortured, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I had once known. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." I nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of the situation. There were no easy answers. No clean resolutions. This wasn't just about loyalty, this was about survival, about being pushed to extremes in a world that had become cruel and unforgiving. "We can't undo the past," I said, my voice steady but heavy. "But we can move forward. Help us now, Anna. Help us stop them before it's too late." Anna hesitated for a long moment, then nodded. I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Maxine's eyes were still hard, but she nodded as well, accepting Anna's words. It was clear that we couldn't afford to let personal feelings cloud our judgment. This was bigger than any one of us. We'll make a plan, Clara said. We'll take down their network, one piece at a time. And so, we began to put together a strategy that would rely on Anna's knowledge of the government's inner workings. It was a risky move, but it was the only way forward. Together, we would take on the enemy from the inside out. As we left the warehouse, the weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air. Anna had betrayed us, yes, but she had also come back, ready to fight. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a chance. A chance we couldn't afford to ignore. The revolution wasn't just about the fight against the government anymore. It was about the fight within ourselves. The fight to forgive, to rebuild, to trust again. And we had to be ready for whatever came next. The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of action, strategy, and constant vigilance. Anna's return to the fold wasn't without its complications, but it was clear that her knowledge of the government's inner circle could be the key to dismantling the system from within. We had no time to waste, and we couldn't afford to let anything, especially lingering doubts, slow us down. Maxine and Clara worked tirelessly to analyze the information Anna provided. Every detail mattered. We could feel the eyes of the government upon us, waiting for a mistake, a crack in the foundation. Every move we made had to be calculated, every decision executed with precision. There was no room for error. Anna was quiet most of the time, her guilt weighing heavily on her. She kept to herself, only speaking when absolutely necessary. Despite her insistence that she was doing this to atone for her past actions, I couldn't help but wonder whether she was truly ready to put her faith in us again. She had betrayed us once. Could we really trust her now? Clara was the first to broach the subject, one evening when the three of us were sitting around the map of the city, plotting our next move. You know, I'm not entirely sure she's back with us, Clara said, her voice low as she examined the documents Anna had handed over. She says all the right things, but can we really believe her? Can we trust that she's not just playing us? I glanced at Maxine, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since Anna's arrival. Her usual sharp gaze was distant, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She met my eyes and then looked away. I knew what she was thinking. I'm not sure, I replied. But right now, she's our best chance. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing ourselves. If Anna knows where the government's weaknesses lie, we have to take advantage of that. Clara sighed, clearly frustrated. But what if she's just using us to cover her tracks? What if the betrayal was just the first phase of something bigger? Maxine finally spoke up, her voice calm but with an edge that couldn't be ignored. If she's playing us, we'll find out soon enough. But the risk of doing nothing is far greater. We need to focus on the bigger picture, taking them down, not worrying about who's holding the knife. Her words resonated deeply, and for a moment, the weight of our situation was too much to bear. We were fighting against an overwhelming enemy, and every step we took felt like a risk. But Maxine was right, there was no time for hesitation. Let's assume Anna is telling the truth, Clara said, pushing aside her doubts. We need to find the next step. If the government's network is as vast as she says, we have to hit them hard, fast. Anna entered the room just as Clara finished speaking, her footsteps soft against the concrete floor. Her eyes flicked to us, then to the map laid out in front of us. She looked worn out, but there was a determination in her that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking about what we're up against, she said quietly, her voice low and steady. I don't know how much time we have, but if we're going to take them down, we need to focus on their core. The ones at the top, those who are really pulling the strings. I nodded. We've been working on that. The leaders, the ones behind the policies, the ones who've been orchestrating this whole thing. If we can expose them, we can cripple the government's ability to respond. Anna's eyes darkened, a flash of something cold crossing her face. It's not just about exposing them. You have to get them out of power. You can't just blow the lid off and hope it all falls apart. You have to take action, direct action. I looked at her, surprised by the intensity in her voice. What are you suggesting? She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking to the map again, her fingers brushing over the marked locations. There's a gathering in 2 weeks. A high-level meeting. All the key players will be there, ministers, military leaders, the works. If we can infiltrate that, if we can disrupt it, we'll have the leverage we need to force them into a corner. Maxine raised an eyebrow. You think you can get us in? Anna hesitated for a moment, her eyes dark and unreadable. I can get you close. But after that, it's on you. You'll need to be ready to act fast. Clara leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. How much do you know about their security? If we're going to make a move, we need to know every angle. Anna's lips curled into a small, tight smile. I know their security systems. I know the guards, the protocols, the blind spots. If you follow my lead, you'll get in without a problem. Maxine stood up and turned to face the rest of us. Then we'll move forward with this plan. But Anna, don't think we've forgotten what you've done. You're not off the hook yet. Anna nodded silently, accepting the unspoken condition. I could tell she understood that she had a lot to prove. Trust wasn't something you could earn back overnight, but at least she was trying. As we finalized the details of the operation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a fine line between victory and disaster. The plan was risky, perhaps more so than anything we had attempted before. But it was the only option we had. 2 weeks felt like a lifetime. The tension grew with each passing day, the stakes higher than ever. We had our plan in place, and now we just had to trust each other, and hope that Anna was leading us down the right path. But as the time drew near, I couldn't help but wonder, could we really trust her? Or was this just another layer of deception, waiting to be unraveled? The day of the operation arrived with a quiet dread hanging over us. It wasn't the kind of day where you could get excited or feel the thrill of an impending victory. No, today felt like the calm before a storm. Everyone was focused, each of us lost in our own thoughts, preparing for what was to come. We had a plan, but even the best plans can unravel in an instant. Anna had delivered on her promise. We had access to the security system's blind spots, the entry points, and the weaknesses in the building's perimeter. There was no way the government could expect us to infiltrate their stronghold so seamlessly. But despite her assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As we geared up, I found myself watching her more closely than usual. The woman who had once betrayed us stood before us now, ready to lead us into the heart of the very system she helped to build. She wasn't the same person as before, not completely, but there was still a coldness in her eyes. A wariness. I couldn't tell if it was just my doubt creeping in or if there was something deeper, something I wasn't seeing. Maxine was the first to break the silence as she adjusted her gear. Stay sharp. The moment we step inside that building, everything changes. There are no second chances. Clara, ever the pragmatist, checked her weapons, her face set in a hard line. We need to get in, get the intel, and get out. We can't afford to get caught in the middle of this. Not now. Anna stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, arms crossed. We've been over this. Stick to the plan, and we'll make it out just fine. I nodded, pushing my doubts aside for the moment. The mission was too important, too urgent, to allow myself to be distracted. We had to trust Anna, at least for now. There was no turning back. The building was a fortress. The government's elite were holding a high-stakes meeting, and we needed to be in and out before anyone even suspected we were there. Anna's intel gave us the edge we needed. We knew where to go, who to avoid, and how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors without triggering any alarms. But even with all of this, the tension was unbearable. The air seemed thicker than usual, and every sound felt like it was magnified. We moved through the shadows, blending into the environment, unnoticed. My heart pounded in my chest, but I focused on the task at hand. Maxine and Clara stayed close, always moving with a purpose, never slowing. Anna led the way, her quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the pulse of fear coursing through me. She moved with the same precision she had when we first worked together, but now, it felt different. It felt colder, more calculated. We reached the meeting room. There was a small, unguarded door near the back, the perfect entry point for what we needed. Anna gestured for us to wait, then she slipped through the door, disappearing into the shadows. The rest of us followed her lead, one by one, slipping inside without a sound. We were in the belly of the beast now. The room was large, filled with polished wood and sleek, cold furniture, everything about it screamed authority. And at the center, sitting at the table, were the people we had come for. I could see their faces now, high-ranking government officials, military leaders, and the powerful elite who had been responsible for so much of the suffering. My skin prickled as I took them all in. The people who had once been untouchable, who operated in the shadows, now sat within our grasp. But we couldn't act yet. We had to wait. The timing had to be perfect. Minutes felt like hours as we stood there, hidden in the dark, watching them converse. The room was filled with sharp voices and sharp minds. They spoke of policies, of movements, of the next steps in their plans for control. It was sickening to hear them speak with such ease about the lives they destroyed, about the systems they manipulated. Anna had been right. These were the ones who needed to be taken down. If we could expose them, if we could sever their hold on power, it would change everything. But just as I was about to signal to Maxine, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind us. My heart stopped. Someone was coming. "Move," Maxine hissed, her voice barely a whisper, as she grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the door. Clara was already ahead of us, her body pressed against the wall. I held my breath as the footsteps grew louder, closer. We couldn't afford to be caught now, not after everything we'd been through. The door creaked as we slid it shut, holding our breath, praying we hadn't been heard. The footsteps passed. It was a close call, but we were still in the game. Anna motioned for us to move, and we continued to creep through the shadows, now aware that time was running out. We were so close. Just a few more steps, and we could strike. But the tension in the air was suffocating. It wasn't just about the mission anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, and what we were willing to sacrifice to bring down this corrupt system. And then it happened. Anna froze. She turned slowly, her eyes widening in shock. I followed her gaze, my heart sinking in my chest. At the far side of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure, someone I never expected to see here. It was Thomas. I felt my blood run cold as I stared at Thomas, standing just beyond the edge of the shadows, his figure barely illuminated by the flickering light. He was supposed to be on our side. He was one of us, someone who had fought beside me, someone who shared the same goals. And yet, here he was, standing in the heart of the government's fortress. For a moment, the room seemed to spin. I couldn't process it. Why was Thomas here? And how had he found us? Maxine's eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Clara was just as tense, her body poised like a coiled spring, ready to react at any moment. But I held up a hand, signaling them to hold back. There was something about Thomas's presence that felt different. He wasn't acting like an enemy, but the shock of seeing him here was too great to ignore. Anna was the first to speak, her voice cold and sharp, as if she were still trying to make sense of the situation. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" Thomas stepped forward, his face unreadable. His usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet urgency. I came to warn you. You're walking into a trap. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. A trap? How could that be? Anna's intel had been flawless. We had planned this down to the smallest detail. We were supposed to be the ones setting the trap, not falling into it. I glanced at Anna, whose expression had shifted from disbelief to suspicion. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. Explain yourself. How do you know about this? Thomas hesitated, his eyes flickering between the group. I didn't come alone, he said finally. I've been monitoring the operation from the inside. I thought you were ready for this, but things have changed. Changed how? I demanded, stepping forward. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. How could we be so close to the finish line, only to be blindsided now? Thomas's gaze flickered nervously. There's been a shift in the power structure. People within the government are moving against you. You've been betrayed. They've known about this mission for weeks. I felt a chill run down my spine. Betrayal. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. How could we have been so careless? How had we missed it? Who? Clara asked, her voice low but fierce. Who's behind this? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. I don't have all the details yet, but I know they've been watching you. The moment you made your move, they activated a counteroffensive. You're not just dealing with the government anymore. There are forces within the system, forces you don't even know about, that have been waiting for this. I exchanged a glance with Maxine. The weight of his words settled in my chest, making it harder to breathe. If what he said was true, we were walking into the lion's den, blindfolded. How do you know all this? Anna pressed, her voice a sharp edge. I have my ways, Thomas replied, his eyes darting to the door behind us. I was brought in as part of a counterintelligence unit. The people who are pulling the strings, they're smarter than you think. They know your moves before you make them. Maxine cursed under her breath. So what now? We turn back. Thomas shook his head. It's not that simple. If you turn back now, they'll know you were tipped off. You'll be marked as traitors. But if you continue, you'll be walking into a full-on ambush. You need to make a choice, and you need to make it fast. The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone was processing the weight of his words, the gravity of what he was telling us. Betrayal was never easy to swallow, but this was different. We weren't just up against an enemy anymore. We were up against a system that had eyes everywhere, watching every move we made. Anna finally broke the silence. We don't have the luxury of time. If we stay here, we'll be found. But if we leave, we'll be hunted. There's no way out but forward. It was the truth. There was no easy answer. But the mission we had started, it couldn't end here. Not now. Not when we were so close to exposing everything. Then we move, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside me. We finish this. We don't let them win. Maxine nodded, her eyes cold with resolve. Agreed. We don't run. Clara was already moving toward the exit, her eyes scanning the hallway for any signs of danger. I'll cover the rear, she muttered. Thomas stepped forward, his gaze shifting between us. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. I didn't respond. We didn't have the luxury of regret. The time for second-guessing was long past. Anna motioned for everyone to follow her. The plan had changed, but the mission hadn't. We couldn't stop now. Not when the stakes were so high. We moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, making our way deeper into the building. Every corner felt like a potential trap, every sound like a harbinger of doom. But we pushed forward, our focus sharper than ever. The stakes had been raised. The danger was greater than we had imagined. As we approached the inner sanctum of the building, I realized something. Thomas was right. We had been set up. But now, we weren't just fighting for survival, we were fighting to bring down an entire system. And we would do whatever it took to see it through. The silence that followed us as we navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the facility felt like a heavy cloak, suffocating our every movement. The air was thick with the tension of what lay ahead. It was no longer just about the mission. It was about survival. As we neared the central control room, the place where the heart of this operation pulsed, every step became a calculated risk. I could feel the weight of our situation, each of us was aware that one wrong move could mean disaster. Thomas was still with us, but his presence was an enigma. He had warned us, yet he had stayed. He had come to help us, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling us everything. Had he been a plant all along? Or was he simply caught in the same web as the rest of us? I couldn't decide. We passed a few guards, their faces expressionless, unaware of our presence. They were likely trained to be oblivious, but something about their lack of awareness seemed strange. It was as if they weren't even trying to keep an eye out for intruders. No, this wasn't a simple defense system. This was a carefully laid trap, designed not just to catch us, but to break us. I could feel the weight of Thomas's eyes on me as we walked. He had always been a steady hand, a calm in the storm, but now he seemed more like a man who had run out of options, just like us. And that unsettled me more than anything. We finally reached the door to the control room. The area was eerily quiet, the hum of machinery and soft beeping of monitors the only sounds in the otherwise sterile space. Clara, ever vigilant, scanned the area first. "It's clear for now," she whispered, though the hesitation in her voice was palpable. Anna nodded, and we moved in, weapons at the ready. Inside, the room was lined with screens, each one showing various locations within the building, along with streams of data that moved too quickly to process. But one thing stood out, an encrypted message scrolling across one of the larger monitors. It was a countdown. I moved closer, squinting at the numbers. "We don't have much time," I muttered. "Whatever's happening, it's happening now." "Let me look at the system," Thomas said, stepping forward as if he had some sort of claim over it. Anna didn't object, but I could feel the weight of her suspicion. The seconds ticked by, every moment we spent in this room felt like a gamble. I kept my eyes on Thomas as he worked, his hands moving rapidly across the keyboard. The tension between us was undeniable, he had come to warn us, but now I was questioning his every move. Finally, Thomas looked up, his face pale. "They've rigged the system," he said. "This entire facility is on a timer. It's set to explode in." Before he could finish, the door to the control room slammed shut. The sound was deafening, echoing through the room like the closing of a tomb. Maxine was the first to react, rushing to the door, trying to force it open. "We're trapped," she hissed. I slammed my fist against the control panel in frustration. We were too late. The countdown wasn't just a warning, it was the activation sequence. A harsh voice crackled through the intercom. "You should have stayed out of it. It's too late now." I recognized the voice. It was one of the officials who had been part of the government's inner circle, someone I thought was an ally. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. We had been betrayed on a deeper level than we realized. This wasn't just a political war, this was a setup, carefully orchestrated from the inside. "Who is that?" Anna demanded, her voice tight with fury. "It's Director Hayes," Thomas said, his voice grim. "He's been playing both sides. He's the one behind this." The countdown continued. We were running out of time, and every second felt like a hammer striking the final nail into our coffin. "What now?" Clara asked, her voice full of suppressed panic. Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers still hovering over the control panel. There's a way to stop it, but I'll need access to the mainframe. It's not here. It's in another room, deeper in the building. The problem is, it's locked down. Only Hayes has the key. We'll get it from him, Maxine said, her voice cold and resolute. We're not letting this happen. But before we could formulate a plan, the room shook violently. The ground beneath us seemed to lurch, and the alarms blared, flooding the space with red light. Something had been triggered. Now or never, I said, drawing my gun. We need to get to Hayes, fast. He's our only chance. With no time to waste, we made our way back through the corridors, our footsteps quick and calculated. The building was no longer just a maze of hallways, it was a death trap, and each turn could lead to our end. Thomas led the way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every step we took felt like a step toward the inevitable. As we neared the room where Hayes was supposedly waiting, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Hayes himself, a smug look on his face, a gun in hand. Did you really think you could win? He sneered. The door slammed shut behind us. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the pit of my stomach. Hayes stood before us, his smirk only deepening as the alarms continued to blare around us. The countdown on the monitors was ticking down relentlessly, the seconds slipping away as if the universe itself were holding its breath. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, his hand still on the control panel, but his face was pale. I could see his mind racing, searching for an escape, a way out. But the door was sealed, and Hayes was far too close. You, Hayes said, his voice dripping with disdain. I knew you would come. I always knew. Did you think you could stop this? That your little rebellion would make a difference? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sized him up, trying to find some weakness in his stance, some hint of fear. But there was none. Hayes was confident, calm, and utterly convinced of his victory. He had all the power now, and we were nothing more than obstacles in his path. What are you trying to accomplish? Maxine demanded, her voice sharp. You're not just blowing up a building, Hayes. You're starting a war. A war that you won't survive. His eyes flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, his smile returning. That's where you're wrong, Maxine. I'm not starting a war. I'm ending one. He glanced at Thomas, a subtle nod of recognition. You should have stayed out of this, Thomas. You knew better than to get involved with these people. Thomas shook his head, his face conflicted, but his resolve hardened. I tried to warn them, he muttered, his voice barely audible. But I can't help you now. Hayes laughed, the sound cold and mocking. Oh, but you already have, Thomas. You've already helped me ensure that this building will become a graveyard for all of you. He turned his gun toward us, aiming directly at me. I tensed, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. The air in the room grew thick with tension, every second dragging on longer than the last. I couldn't let him kill us. I wouldn't let him. But I knew we were up against more than just a man with a gun. This was a mind game. And he was playing it with all the pieces. That's enough. Clara shouted, stepping forward, her voice shaking but determined. You've already set this place to blow. What more do you want, Hayes? Do you really think you can control everything? Hayes's eyes flashed with irritation, but he didn't lower the gun. I don't need to control everything, Clara. I just need to control the outcome. And you're not going to stop it. There was a beat of silence. Then, without warning, Clara lunged forward, knocking the gun from Hayes's hands. The move was fast, calculated, and it took him off guard. But Hayes wasn't unprepared. He spun, trying to regain his footing, but Clara had already stepped aside, her back to the door, cutting off his escape. In that moment, we had the upper hand. But not for long. Hayes's expression twisted into a snarl, and he reached for a small device at his belt. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "I have a failsafe." The device was a trigger, one that would detonate the explosives instantly. He didn't need to press a button. It was built into the system, and with one move, he could make everything disappear. "Stop him!" I yelled, but it was too late. Hayes had already pressed the button. The countdown on the screen skipped to its final seconds. Time had run out. But we didn't give up. We couldn't. In a blur, Maxine dove for Hayes, slamming her body into him. Her fists landed in quick succession, and Hayes stumbled backward, the failsafe device slipping from his hand. But as he tried to regain control, the device fell to the floor with a hollow clang. I rushed forward, grabbing the device, my mind racing. One wrong move, and we were finished. "Clara!" I shouted. "Cover me!" Clara nodded and moved into position, her weapon trained on Hayes. But Hayes was relentless, his movements frenzied as he tried to reach for his gun. I fumbled with the device, fingers slick with sweat. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast. Was it too late? Had we already failed? But then, as if by some miracle, I found the switch. With a trembling hand, I flipped it. The countdown on the screen halted. There was a collective sigh of relief that filled the room, so sharp and so brief, it felt like a breath taken after being submerged underwater. Hayes froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. The tension in his face melted into pure fury. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice a hiss of venom. "You haven't stopped anything." But the truth was, we had. The countdown was no longer ticking toward destruction. We had disarmed the trigger. For now. I stepped forward, the device in my hands, my mind still reeling from the close call. "It's over, Hayes. You've lost." But as he looked at us, his gaze never wavered. "This war is far from over," he growled. And with that, the door burst open. Reinforcements. We were surrounded. The door slammed open with a deafening crash, sending a shockwave of tension through the room. More figures appeared in the doorway, armed and determined. I could see their faces, familiar enemies, the ones who had stood with Hayes through this entire operation. They were not just soldiers. They were the endgame of everything he had worked for. Their eyes met mine, cold and unyielding. I gripped the disarmed failsafe device tighter, the weight of it now more symbolic than practical. Hayes's expression was unreadable, but I could feel his fury seething beneath the surface. "You think you've stopped me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing. Just pawns in a game you can't even begin to understand." I couldn't let him get inside my head. We had come this far. We had nearly lost everything, but now we had a chance. A small chance, but a chance nonetheless. And we couldn't squander it. "Clara, Maxine," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. "We have to move now. There's no time." Maxine nodded, her face taut with concentration as she checked her weapons. Clara remained silent, her eyes scanning the incoming soldiers with surgical precision. Hayes had made his move, but we were not done yet. The war was still winnable, if only we could stay one step ahead. Suddenly, Thomas stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "I can disable their communications from here," he said, his voice tight. "But I'll need cover." I glanced at Clara. She didn't hesitate. "I'll cover you. Just make it count." Thomas sprinted toward a nearby control panel, his fingers already flying over the keys. The enemy soldiers were closing in on us, but we had no choice but to trust him. If he could sever their comms, we could disorient them, throw them off long enough to escape or fight back. Hayes was still watching us, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes cold and calculating. He was waiting, expecting us to make a mistake. But I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew the tide had shifted. "You're not getting away," he warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't underestimate us," I snapped, moving to stand between him and my team. My gun was still holstered, but my hand rested on the hilt, ready to draw if needed. Suddenly, the sound of the control room door sliding open again cut through the tension. More soldiers, this time, reinforcements from the other side of the building, poured in. The odds were now more stacked against us than ever before. Hayes had thought ahead, positioning his forces to trap us in this very room. The situation was dire. I made a split-second decision. "Maxine, take out the left flank," I ordered. "Clara, stay on the right with me. We'll create an opening for Thomas." Maxine didn't flinch, immediately darting to the left side of the room. Her movements were fluid, precise, a blur of deadly intent. She took out two of the soldiers almost effortlessly, their bodies crumpling to the floor with swift, practiced efficiency. Clara was right behind her, her eyes never leaving the enemy, her weapon drawn and ready. I moved toward Thomas, hoping to give him just enough time. Hayes was no longer a threat in my mind. The soldiers with him were, but he had lost the initiative. His posture was defensive now, more hesitant. The pressure was mounting on him, and I wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Thomas, hurry," I urged, knowing that the more time we wasted, the more likely we were to be overrun. He was at the console now, sweat dripping from his brow, his fingers flying across the controls. He was close, so close. Then came the sound of gunfire. Maxine had engaged the right flank, her sharp aim taking down two more soldiers with chilling precision. But the rest were closing in fast. We didn't have much time. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely audible over the sound of the chaos around us. "I've got it. Communications are down." The change was instant. The soldiers no longer moved with the synchronized precision they once had. They were disoriented, confused, looking to each other for orders that would never come. It was our chance. I looked at Clara and Maxine. Now. Without hesitation, we charged, pushing forward through the confusion. Hayes moved to intercept us, but I wasn't about to let him take the lead in this final moment. The fight was coming to a head, and we were going to win. I ducked low, dodging a bullet from Hayes's sidearm as it skimmed over my head. He was trying to protect himself and his men, but he underestimated our resolve. We had nothing left to lose. Maxine engaged the remaining soldiers, her combat skills more fluid than I had ever seen. Clara covered her, moving like a shadow through the chaos. I pushed forward, using the moment of confusion to get closer to Hayes. "End this," I said as I reached him, my voice low but unwavering. Hayes turned, eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won?" he snarled, lunging toward me with his weapon raised. I was faster. I grabbed his wrist, twisting it, forcing the weapon to the ground with a single, fluid motion. In the next moment, I had him pinned, his face pressed to the cold, hard floor. The final breath he took was one of defeat, not victory. But there was no time for celebration. The building was still rigged to explode, and we had no idea if the countdown had been halted permanently. I looked at my team, the resolve in their eyes matching my own. "We need to move, now," I barked. We ran for the exit, every footstep heavy with the weight of our survival. Behind us, the building groaned, the threat of destruction still hanging in the air. The countdown was ticking. It didn't matter that Hayes was down. It didn't matter that we had taken out his soldiers or shut down their communications. The building was rigged, and it was counting down to oblivion. As we raced toward the exit, the corridors seemed to stretch on forever, the sound of our footsteps echoing like the drumbeat of an impending death. Maxine took point, her gun ready, eyes scanning every corner. Clara was right behind her, tense but composed, every step deliberate. Thomas was at the back, still breathless from the hacking he'd done moments earlier. "We're not out of here yet," Maxine muttered, voice low but urgent. "Keep moving," I snapped, pushing us forward. My heart was pounding in my chest, a heavy weight threatening to slow me down, but there was no room for fear now. We couldn't afford to hesitate. The last few floors of the building felt like a maze, each turn a potential trap. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The hum of the air conditioning system was gone, replaced by a sinister silence that seemed to cling to the place like a second skin. We reached the final set of doors leading out into the open, but as we stepped forward, a shrill alarm blared, drowning out everything else. Red lights flashed above us, bathing the hallway in a violent, pulsing glow. "They've activated the lockdown," Clara said, her eyes darting to the ceiling where the red lights blinked relentlessly. "No time," I shouted. "Get to the exit." But the doors didn't open. The security system had been triggered, and there was nothing we could do to override it from here. We were trapped. "Thomas, can you?" I began, but I was cut off by a sudden explosion from below, the shockwave rattling the building. Dust and debris rained down on us, and the walls groaned under the pressure. "Damn it," Thomas swore under his breath, his fingers already on the panel, trying to bypass the security lock. "It's not gonna be easy, but I can do it. Just cover me." Maxine didn't need further prompting. She swung her gun into position, eyes narrowed as she scanned the now entrapped hallway for any signs of movement. She was the first to notice them, soldiers, pouring in from a side corridor, guns raised, their faces shadowed but unmistakably hostile. "Incoming," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. She didn't wait for confirmation before she opened fire. The first soldier fell in a heap, but more were coming, and there was no time to waste. The walls began to shake more violently, and the muffled sounds of secondary explosions echoed from deeper within the building. We were on a ticking clock, and the pressure was mounting by the second. "Cover fire," I ordered, moving quickly to the side and finding partial cover behind a fallen column. My hands were steady, but my mind raced. We had to get to Thomas, and we had to get out, or all of this would have been for nothing. I popped out from cover just long enough to take down two soldiers, their bodies hitting the floor in unison with the echoes of gunfire. Clara was beside me, her calm precision a stark contrast to the chaos around us. She was already taking out soldiers as they tried to flank us, her aim sharp, every shot finding its mark. Thomas was still at the console, his face a mask of concentration as he worked desperately to bypass the system. I could see his fingers flying across the keys, but the pressure was building. We couldn't hold off the soldiers forever, and we couldn't afford to wait. "Come on, come on," I muttered to myself, watching as Thomas typed in the last command. Then, with a quiet click, the heavy doors slid open, releasing a gust of cool air from outside. The first sign of freedom. Maxine didn't wait for orders. She was already moving, her gun raised as she cleared a path for us. We followed, sprinting toward the exit as the building around us seemed to fall apart. The ground shook again, and this time, we felt it beneath our feet. Just as we reached the doors, a massive explosion erupted from behind us, the force sending us all sprawling onto the pavement outside. I hit the ground hard, my head spinning from the impact, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself up, instinctively looking for my team. "Everyone all right?" I called out, my voice hoarse. Maxine was the first to stand, a fierce grin on her face despite the chaos around us. "Never better," she said, dusting herself off. Clara was already on her feet, her eyes scanning the horizon for any further threats. Thomas joined us a moment later, his face ashen but determined. "We made it," he said, voice steady despite the obvious strain. "But I don't think this place is going to stand much longer." Behind us, the building was beginning to collapse in on itself. The sky was filled with smoke and dust as debris fell from the structure, crashing to the ground with terrifying force. I looked at the team, each of them standing tall despite everything that had happened. We had come so close to losing everything, but now we had something else, freedom. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. The mission was over. Hayes was done. The threat had been neutralized. But there was still so much more ahead. We didn't have all the answers. But we had each other, and we had a chance to rebuild. And that was enough. The world seemed to pause for a moment as the dust settled around us. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, and the debris from the building's collapse sent tremors through the ground beneath our feet. We were all silent for a beat, taking in the weight of what we had just survived. But there was no time for reflection. Maxine checked the surrounding area, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm, eyes scanning for any signs of danger. She had the same intensity as always, but today, there was something else in her stance, a subtle hint of exhaustion, the kind that only comes from surviving something as close as we had. Clara wasn't far behind, her eyes sharp but distant, like she was already processing the next phase. Thomas, on the other hand, was holding his breath, as if waiting for a sign that we hadn't just made a monumental mistake. "Is everyone okay?" I asked again, still trying to make sure no one was injured in the explosion, though I already knew the answer. We were bruised, battered, and shaken, but we had survived. Maxine gave a half grin, but it was laced with more fatigue than triumph. "We're alive. That's what matters right now." "Not exactly the victory we were hoping for," Thomas said, rubbing his temples. "But at least we got out. Still don't know if we got everything we needed, though." He was right. The intel we had obtained from Hayes headquarters was valuable, but there were still so many unanswered questions. The extent of the damage we'd inflicted on his operation was uncertain, and there were loose ends that needed to be tied up. The world didn't stop for us just because we'd taken down one man. "We'll deal with that later," I said, my voice firm despite the lingering uncertainty in my chest. "Let's get to a safe house. We need to regroup and figure out our next move." The team nodded in agreement, and we made our way through the wreckage, careful of our steps as we moved away from the crumbling ruins. There was a quiet intensity to our movement now, each of us knowing that the end of one chapter didn't mean the beginning of the next would be any easier. We reached the extraction point after a grueling half-hour of navigating through the abandoned streets. The safe house we had arranged was a few blocks away from the site of the explosion, a small, inconspicuous building tucked between two larger office complexes. It was a place we could lay low for a while, regroup, and figure out our next steps without the risk of being caught by any lingering forces loyal to Hayes or anyone else who might be watching. As we entered the safe house, the door shut behind us with a soft click. The space was sparse, with only the essentials: cots, a few chairs, and a table cluttered with maps, files, and laptops. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. Maxine slumped into a chair, her eyes flicking over the map of the city on the wall. Clara started working on setting up a perimeter, checking the cameras and securing the windows. Thomas, despite his earlier exhaustion, was already pulling out his laptop, diving into the files we'd taken from Hayes headquarters. I walked over to the table, sitting down across from him. "Anything useful?" Thomas didn't look up from the screen as he clicked through the files. "A few things. Hayes had connections we didn't know about, larger players, international reach. Some of this is way beyond what we were anticipating." I frowned, the gravity of his words sinking in. "How much worse is it?" "Hard to say yet," Thomas replied, his tone grim. "But we might be looking at a whole new level of trouble. Hayes was just the tip of the iceberg." I leaned back, processing the new information. It was a lot to take in. We had all believed that taking down Hayes would be the end of this nightmare. But now, it seemed like we were only just beginning to scratch the surface of something far more dangerous. If Hayes was connected to international networks, if there were bigger players involved, then we had no idea what we were truly up against. "How much time do we have?" I asked. Thomas shook his head. It's hard to say, but we need to move fast. If Hayes had these connections, they'll be looking for retaliation. We can't afford to stay here too long. Then we don't waste any more time, Maxine said, standing up and walking over to the map. We find out who these people are. We hit them before they have a chance to strike back. I nodded. Agreed. We stay one step ahead. Clara, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward, her voice steady. We'll need more resources. More intel. And we'll need to bring in allies, people who can help us take down these larger players. Alone, we won't stand a chance. I looked at her, appreciating the pragmatism in her words. She was right. We couldn't do this alone. We'd burned through our resources taking down Hayes, and now we had to rebuild, find new ways to infiltrate and disrupt this growing web of power. We'll reach out to our contacts, I said, standing up and walking over to the table where I had a burner phone hidden away. We'll need all the help we can get. The team fell into a rhythm, each of us slipping into our roles. Maxine and Clara worked on gathering more information from the files and strategizing their next moves. Thomas dug deeper into the digital landscape, uncovering links between Hayes and the shadowy network of financiers, politicians, and mercenaries that spanned several continents. As I watched them work, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just stepped into a far bigger battle than any of us had ever expected. The fight with Hayes was over, but the war was just beginning. The only question now was whether we could survive long enough to finish it. The quiet of the safe house was deceptive. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Inside, the hum of the computers and the shuffle of papers filled the air as the team worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments we had gathered. But despite our progress, there was an underlying tension, a gnawing feeling that we were running out of time. Every second spent in this safe house felt like we were closer to being found, closer to being exposed. Any word from the contacts? I asked, standing by the window and glancing out at the empty streets. The city felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Maxine's voice broke through my thoughts. Nothing yet. But I'm not expecting anything quick. People in this world move in the shadows, they don't rush into anything. True, I said, rubbing my temples. I had to remind myself that we were playing the long game now. The next phase of this operation wasn't going to be as easy as hitting Hayes headquarters. We were up against a global network, and it would take time to bring it down piece by piece. Clara was reviewing the intel on the table, her eyes narrowed as she flipped through the pages. There's a pattern here, she muttered, almost to herself. Hayes was just one part of a larger operation. The people he was connected to, they've been working under the radar for years. I walked over to her, curious. What do you mean? She looked up, her face grim. These are names we've seen before. Not directly tied to Hayes, but in the background. Business deals, shady investments, large financial transfers, things that never seemed to make sense before. But now, looking at it all together, it's clear. Hayes wasn't just a rogue actor. He was a cog in a much bigger machine. That stopped me in my tracks. If Hayes wasn't the main player, then who was? And how much power did they hold? Maxine joined us at the table, leaning in to take a look at the documents Clara had laid out. So, we're not just dealing with criminals, she said. We're dealing with people with connections. Powerful connections. People who can hide in plain sight. It's worse than that, Clara added, flipping through a few more pages. Hayes was laundering money for them. Funding operations, covert actions, all under the guise of legitimate business. We've seen these names pop up before: construction companies, financial institutions, arms dealers. This is a global syndicate. I let the weight of her words settle over me. A global syndicate. This was bigger than anything we had imagined. And now that we had exposed a few of its threads, it felt like the whole web was tightening around us. "We can't take them down the same way we did Hayes," Thomas said, his voice coming from across the room. He had been focused on his laptop for the past few hours, his eyes flicking between screens. "This isn't just about hitting one target. This is about dismantling a network, and that means we need to be smarter. More strategic." "Agreed," I said, turning to him. "We can't go in guns blazing like before. We need intel, and we need allies. Clara, Maxine, start reaching out to anyone you think can help. Thomas, dig deeper into their financial ties. We need to know who's funding them and where their money is coming from. We hit them in the wallet, it'll hurt more than any bullet." Maxine's sharp eyes met mine. "We'll need to be careful, though. The more we dig, the more attention we attract. And if we're not careful, we'll be the ones getting hunted." I nodded, understanding the risks. We were already being watched, and every move we made would be monitored. The network we were up against had the resources to track us, and we had no idea how deep their influence ran. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything we've been through. "Then we move quickly and quietly," I said, my voice steady. "We gather our intel, we make our move when the time is right. We're not just going to take them down. We're going to make them regret ever thinking they could operate in the shadows." Clara's lips curled into a faint smile. "Regret?" I was thinking more along the lines of ruin. "That works too," I said with a grin. We fell into a rhythm over the next few days, a careful balance of surveillance, intel gathering, and strategic planning. Maxine and Clara worked the network, using their contacts to uncover more about the syndicate's operations, while Thomas dug through layers of financial data, tracing every penny Hayes had laundered and connecting it to bigger players. The more we learned, the more I realized just how vast and intricate the web was. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. Power over governments, over industries, over entire populations. The syndicate's reach extended into every corner of the world, and they had the means to protect themselves at any cost. But we weren't backing down. Late one night, as we sat around the table in the dimly lit room, Clara spoke up, her voice low but urgent. "I found something. A name. It's not a big lead, but it's something. It's a contact, someone higher up in the syndicate. They're supposed to meet with a few others tomorrow night." I leaned forward, heart racing. "Where?" "Downtown. A private club. It's not listed anywhere, but I've got the address. This is our chance to get close. If we move fast, we can intercept them before they disappear again." Maxine was already on her feet, her jacket slung over her shoulder. "Let's move." I looked at the team, and without a word, we gathered our gear and moved out, ready to take on the next phase of this war. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But we were finally getting somewhere. We were taking the fight to them. And this time, we were ready. The city was a different place at night. The neon lights blurred into long streaks of color as our cars sped through the empty streets, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional click of a phone or the rustle of a jacket. Everyone was focused, tense. We had no idea what we were walking into, but we couldn't afford to hesitate. Every second we wasted could mean the difference between success and failure. The location Clara had uncovered was in one of the wealthier districts, hidden among exclusive clubs and upscale restaurants. It wasn't just a private club, it was an ultra-secure facility, known for hosting the kind of high-profile meetings that made the average citizen's head spin. Politicians, business moguls, and criminals alike crossed paths there, their conversations sealed behind layers of security. It was the perfect place for the syndicate to operate undisturbed. We parked a few blocks away, blending into the shadows, and took our gear out of the trunk. Maxine and Thomas double-checked their weapons, making sure everything was ready in case we had to make a quick exit. Clara was scrolling through her tablet, her fingers tapping rapidly. She had done her homework, finding every possible detail about the club's layout and its security systems. "There's a back entrance," she said, her voice quiet. "It's less guarded, but it leads straight to the private rooms where the meeting's supposed to happen. We'll need to move fast once we're inside." I nodded. We had one shot at this. If we got caught, the entire operation would be compromised. Maxine shot me a look. "We're sure about this? No second chances here." I locked eyes with her. "We can't wait. We know they're meeting tonight, and we don't know when we'll get another shot. We take it now, or we risk losing everything." Without another word, we moved out, slipping through the shadows and heading toward the back entrance of the club. The closer we got, the more the tension in the air seemed to thicken. The weight of the unknown hung over us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into a trap. We reached the door without incident, and Clara quickly hacked into the security system, disabling the cameras and unlocking the door. She gestured for us to move inside. We entered the building and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low murmur of conversation, but it was all too quiet. Too controlled. We stuck to the shadows, moving through the narrow hallways with practiced ease, every step measured and silent. As we neared the meeting room, I could hear voices, a low murmur, too distant to make out. But I knew they were there. We were getting close. "Get ready," I whispered, signaling for the team to stop. We were just outside the door now. Maxine and Thomas took positions on either side, while Clara prepared her equipment to track the meeting. The door was made of thick oak, reinforced with a steel core. There was no way to listen in directly, but the small device Clara had set up could tap into the room's audio feed and give us real-time intel. We were relying on it. I watched as Clara glanced at the screen, her face lighting up with urgency. "They're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Get in position." I gave a quick nod and motioned for Maxine and Thomas to follow me. We had no backup, this was a hit-and-run mission. If we succeeded, we could gather crucial intel on the syndicate's inner circle. If we failed, I didn't want to think about failure. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. It creaked ever so slightly, and for a split second, I thought it would be enough to give us away. But the voices inside didn't falter. No one noticed. The room was dimly lit, filled with thick leather chairs, low tables, and expensive artwork hanging on the walls. A round table sat at the center, where three men in suits were deep in conversation. They didn't look like the usual criminals we had been tracking, they were polished, composed, and far too comfortable in their power. I felt a sharp pang of realization, these men were the ones calling the shots. Hayes had been just a pawn. I gestured to the team. Maxine and Thomas moved into position while Clara stayed behind, ready to transmit the intel. I crept closer, careful to avoid making any noise that might give us away. I could hear snippets of their conversation now, names, dates, and locations. They were discussing something big, something that could change the entire game. I strained to catch more details, but it was like they knew we were there. Suddenly, one of the men turned, his eyes landing directly on me. For a moment, time froze. Then, without hesitation, the man reached for his gun, but Maxine was faster. She shot first. The man crumpled to the floor in a heap, and chaos erupted in the room. The other two men pulled their guns, but they were already too late. Thomas fired, taking out one of them with a clean shot. The last man, realizing his fate, tried to make a run for the door, but I was already there. I moved fast, grabbing him by the shoulder and slamming him into the wall. He let out a strangled cry as I pulled his arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground. "Talk," I demanded, my voice cold. "Who do you work for?" The man gritted his teeth, his face twisted in defiance. "You think you can stop this?" You have no idea what you're up against. I leaned in, tightening my grip on his arm. I don't need to know everything. Just tell me what I need to know. Now. He sneered, but I could see the fear in his eyes. You're out of your league. This isn't something you can fight. It's too big. I didn't care about his threats. Who's behind this? He opened his mouth to speak, but just as the words were about to come out, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hall. More were coming. Get ready, I whispered. We're not done yet. The footsteps were getting louder, echoing down the hallway with terrifying precision. I had no doubt that backup was on the way, and we were far from prepared for a full-scale firefight. The last thing we needed was a battle inside this confined space. I glanced at Maxine and Thomas. They were already moving, positioning themselves near the door, guns in hand, ready for whatever came next. Clara was at the far end of the room, eyes glued to her tablet as she tried to maintain control of the data stream. I tightened my grip on the man on the floor, willing him to speak, but he just snarled at me, blood trickling from his lip. The room was a scene of controlled chaos now. Our initial strike had taken down 2 of them, but there was no telling how many more were hiding in the shadows. I had a moment's hesitation, just a split second where doubt crept in. Maybe we had gone too far, too fast. But the feeling passed quickly. We had no time for second-guessing. Talk, I growled again, leaning in closer, my voice cold as ice. What's this all about? Who's behind all of this? The man laughed, a low, bitter sound that sent a chill through my spine. You think they'll let you take me alive? You're nothing but pawns in this game. His words were laced with venom, and I could feel the weight of them as they hung in the air. I wasn't sure if he was bluffing or if he truly believed we were doomed, but I wasn't in the mood for games. Tell me what I need to know, I pressed, and maybe you'll walk out of here. Keep quiet, and you won't leave at all. He glared at me, defiant and unmoved. I'm already dead. It doesn't matter. You think you can stop them, but you won't. They're everywhere. You'll never see it coming. I could feel the tension building in the air. His words were dangerous, but I didn't have time to dissect them. We needed answers, and we needed them now. Suddenly, the sound of more footsteps broke my concentration. A lot more. This wasn't a simple guard patrol, it sounded like an entire security team closing in on our position. We had no way out. Clara looked up, her face ashen. We're about to be surrounded. They've activated the emergency lockdown protocol. We're trapped. I cursed under my breath. I had no idea how they could have tracked us this quickly, but the fact that we were cornered in a high-security building didn't bode well. We had no choice but to fight our way out. Move, I said sharply, pulling the man to his feet and shoving him toward the door. We couldn't afford to leave him behind, he might be our only chance at getting more intel, especially now that we were running out of time. The room erupted in movement as we sprang into action. Maxine and Thomas took up defensive positions by the door, their weapons aimed at the hallway. The man I had been interrogating gave us a final, spiteful glare but kept his mouth shut. It didn't matter. We didn't need his cooperation anymore. We heard the unmistakable sound of guards rushing towards us from both directions. They were closing in fast. The emergency lights began flashing, bathing the hallways in red. It felt like the walls were closing in. Clara hit a few buttons on her tablet. I've disabled the internal cameras, but we've got about a minute before they bring in reinforcements from the security center. We need to move, now. Without a word, I motioned for Maxine and Thomas to cover us while Clara took the lead, guiding us down a narrow corridor that led toward a maintenance exit. It wasn't ideal, but it was our best shot. As we hurried down the dark hallway, I kept a wary eye on the rear, expecting the sound of gunfire to follow us at any moment. The man we had taken captive stumbled along behind us, his hands still bound, his face twisted in anger and frustration. "You think this is over," he sneered. "You have no idea what you're really dealing with. You think you're the heroes here, but all you've done is make things worse. You've only scratched the surface." I barely registered his words. I was too focused on getting us out of here alive. But as we rounded the corner and reached the maintenance exit, something about his tone struck a nerve. The heavy door creaked as we shoved it open, and the blinding daylight hit us like a physical blow. We had made it outside, but it wasn't over. Not yet. "We need to get to the extraction point," Clara said, her voice urgent. "They're coming. And they're coming fast." I nodded. We couldn't afford to stick around any longer. We had one shot at escaping, and I wasn't about to lose it now. We ran through the alley, weaving in and out of shadows as we neared the rendezvous point where our getaway vehicle was waiting. The sound of sirens in the distance told us that the clock was ticking. We had mere moments before the entire city was locked down, and every law enforcement officer would be out looking for us. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, every sense on high alert. It felt like we were being hunted, the walls closing in from every direction. But as we reached the extraction point and the black SUV slid to a stop in front of us, I realized just how much danger we had come through. We were barely alive, but we had made it. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, pushing the others into the vehicle as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The engine roared to life, and we sped off into the night, our future uncertain. As we drove through the streets, I glanced at the man in the back seat. He was still silent, eyes narrowed in hate, but there was something different in the way he held himself now. I knew he was trying to figure out his next move. But we had him. And he was going to talk. I would make sure of it. The night air rushed past as the SUV tore through the city, its tires screeching on the slick asphalt. We couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, but every mile we put between us and the compound only seemed to draw us closer to the storm that was about to break. We had a few hours, maybe less, before every law enforcement officer in the city would be looking for us. The operation was compromised. There was no going back. I glanced at the man, still silent in the back seat. His posture was stiff, but his eyes had changed since we grabbed him. The fire had dimmed a little, replaced with something I couldn't quite place, a mixture of fear and regret, perhaps, but also something darker. He knew we were his only hope now. Or perhaps he was waiting for an opening, a crack in our defenses to turn the tables. "You can stop pretending," I said without looking back. My voice was calm, but the pressure was mounting in my chest. "You're not getting out of this unless you talk." He didn't respond, but I could see the twitch in his jaw, the muscle tightening as if resisting the urge to say something. I leaned back in the seat, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head. "We know this isn't just a random operation," I continued, keeping my tone even. "This is bigger. You're not just some hired gun, are you? You're a part of something much more dangerous." The man's lips curled into a sneer, but the fire had completely left his eyes. "You have no idea what you're up against. They'll find you, no matter where you go." I glanced over at Clara, who was driving with an expression that seemed carved from stone. Her fingers gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The silence stretched between us for a moment before she broke it. "We can't afford to waste time. The intel we need is on that hard drive. And whatever this guy knows could be the key to understanding who's really pulling the strings. If we don't figure it out soon, we're going to be the ones in the crosshairs." Maxine, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced at the rearview mirror. "And what if he doesn't talk? What then?" I turned slightly to look at the man, his eyes staring out the window now, lost in thought. "We'll make him talk. One way or another." But as I said those words, a feeling gnawed at me. We weren't just dealing with a rogue element or some petty criminal. This was a network, an invisible hand guiding everything from the shadows. And that shadow was growing closer with each passing minute. We pulled into a quiet industrial area on the outskirts of the city, a place where we could lay low for a while, regroup. The van was already waiting for us, parked under the cover of an old warehouse. We hadn't been followed, at least, we hadn't seen anyone on our tail. But I wasn't naive enough to believe we were out of danger yet. This was just the calm before the storm. "Get him out," I ordered as we pulled to a stop. We needed to move fast. Maxine and Thomas flanked the man as they dragged him from the SUV and forced him inside the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. It was a far cry from the sterile, high-tech operations we'd been involved in earlier, but it was safe, for now. Clara set up a small tech station against one of the walls, already working on decrypting the drive we'd taken from the compound. The screen in front of her flickered to life, showing lines of encrypted code. "I've bypassed some of the security layers," she muttered under her breath, tapping at the keyboard. "This won't be fast, but I can get us in." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the man. He had settled in one of the metal chairs we'd set up in the center of the room, still refusing to speak. His hands were cuffed to the arms of the chair, his expression unreadable. Maxine stood nearby, watching him closely. Thomas kept pacing the room, his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. I stepped forward, my voice low and controlled. "You can make this easy on yourself. Help us, and you get a chance to walk out of here. But if you keep playing the martyr, you'll find out that I'm not as forgiving as I look." The man met my gaze, his eyes cold, unwavering. "You think you're the first ones to try to break me? I've had worse. I've been through worse." I leaned in, my tone hardening. "Then you'll know how this goes. We're running out of time. Help us understand what's really happening here, or I'll make sure you never get another chance to breathe freely." His lips twitched as if considering my words, but then he shook his head. "You'll never get it. You're just pawns in a game you don't understand." Something about his words struck a chord deep in me. I'd heard that line before. But from who? Before I could press further, Clara's voice cut through the tension. "Got it. The drive's decrypted. But it's not what we thought. There are files here, lots of them, but there's one that stands out. It's marked Project Phantom." "Project Phantom?" I echoed, my mind racing. That didn't sound like something we were supposed to find. Not something that was meant for us. Clara scrolled through the data, her face grim. "It's a list of names, high-ranking officials, corporate leaders, politicians, and there are codes next to each one. Looks like they're all connected to a larger operation. A network that spans continents." "Connections," I muttered. "That's what this is about. Whoever's behind this, they're trying to manipulate everything. These people," I trailed off, the weight of the revelation sinking in. This was far bigger than we had anticipated. Maxine stepped forward, her voice steady. "So what's the next move?" I turned to the man, my eyes narrowing. "Now we're going to find out what he knows about Project Phantom. And we're going to use it to take down everyone involved, starting with the head of the snake." The tension in the warehouse was thick enough to cut through with a knife. The screen in front of Clara flashed with cryptic data, as she pieced together the puzzle of Project Phantom. I stood a few feet away, my hands resting on the cold metal of a nearby crate, my mind racing through what we'd uncovered. High-ranking officials, corporate tycoons, politicians. The world as we knew it was a mask for something much darker, something that had been hidden beneath the surface for years. And now, it was our job to unearth it all. The man, who still hadn't given us his name, was sitting in the same chair, his face unreadable, but I could tell he was processing everything. It was only a matter of time before he broke, and I was determined to make that time come sooner rather than later. "Who's behind this?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the silence. "Who's the leader of this operation?" The man didn't flinch, though I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt? Fear? Or perhaps something more sinister? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, he muttered, his voice almost a whisper. I'm not here to play games, I replied, my voice steady but laced with menace. You're going to tell me everything you know. If not for your sake, then for the sake of everyone who's going to suffer because of this. The man's eyes narrowed, and for the first time since we'd captured him, a shadow of something almost human passed over his face. You don't understand, he said, his voice growing louder now. The people behind this, they control everything. They can make or break anyone. You're chasing ghosts. Maxine, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. You want us to believe that? After everything we've seen? You think we're just going to walk away because you're scared? The man hesitated. He was clearly weighing his options, calculating the risks of speaking against the people he was so clearly afraid of. I'm not afraid, he said after a long silence. But you will be. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking with mine. Project Phantom, it's not just about money, power, or control. It's about erasing people. Wiping them off the map and rewriting history. Every name you see on that list. They're marked for termination. My heart skipped a beat. Termination. The man nodded. These people don't just use influence or power. They have connections in every corner of the world. They don't just kill, they make people disappear. Entire families, entire communities, erased without a trace. It's what they do. I felt a chill creep down my spine. The magnitude of what we were up against was unfathomable. This wasn't some conspiracy with a few corrupt officials. This was something far more sinister, a shadowy cabal operating on a global scale. Who's at the top? Clara asked, her voice now firm with authority. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't know. I wasn't high enough in the chain to know who the real leaders are. But the ones pulling the strings, they don't stay in the open. They hide behind intermediaries. People who look clean, who play the game by the rules, but who pull the levers from the shadows. And when they do, they move entire countries like pieces on a chessboard. Who? I pressed, my patience fraying. Give me a name. He shook his head. I don't have one. But there's a name on that list you need to pay attention to. A name that you should know by now. The rest of the people on the list, they're just pawns. But there's one person who sits at the head of this whole operation. They've been untouchable. I could feel the air in the room shift, the weight of his words sinking in. Who? Maxine asked again, her voice tight with urgency. The man's eyes dropped, and for the first time since we had started, there was a flicker of fear. His name is Dominic Reyes. I felt the blood drain from my face as the name hit me like a sledgehammer. Reyes. The one name we'd never dared utter out loud. The man whose hands were in every dirty deal, every crime we'd been investigating. He was the one pulling the strings behind the curtain, and we had just stumbled into his world. Dominic Reyes, I repeated, the name tasting foreign on my tongue. You know him? The man asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. We've been hunting him for years, I said through clenched teeth. But he's been untouchable. We've never been able to connect him to anything. The man gave a hollow laugh. That's the point. Reyes doesn't leave fingerprints. He has people like me do the dirty work. But he's always been one step ahead, always pulling the strings from the shadows. And those who get too close, disappear. We'll find him, I said, my voice low but resolute. And we'll make him pay for everything he's done. There was a beat of silence before the man finally spoke again, his voice almost a whisper. If you go after Reyes, you're not just going up against a criminal. You're going up against a global empire. And it's not going to end with him. They'll come for you, your families, your friends. Anyone close to you will be collateral damage. Then we take him down, I said, my resolve hardening. And we take them all down with him. This ends now. But as I said those words, a cold sense of dread settled in my chest. Reyes wasn't just some untouchable kingpin in a criminal empire. He was the puppet master, and we had just walked into his trap. Maxine, Thomas, and Clara exchanged looks, but no one said a word. We all knew what had to be done, but the weight of the task before us was immense. The man, still shackled to the chair, watched us with a mix of resignation and something like pity. "You won't survive this," he muttered, his voice filled with a strange finality. "None of you will." The warehouse was silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights and the distant echo of raindrops beating against the metal roof. Dominic Reyes. The name sent a ripple of unease through me that I couldn't shake. For years, we had chased shadows, investigated connections, and followed dead-end leads, all in the hope of exposing the truth. But Reyes was the source, the nexus of everything. We had finally reached the heart of the storm. But the question was, how do we take down a man who has built an empire on deception, fear, and manipulation? Maxine leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, her face set in a grim line. "So, we have a name. But we're no closer to finding him." Thomas, ever the optimist, tried to offer a more hopeful perspective. "At least now we know who's behind all of this. And if Reyes is the one pulling the strings, maybe we can start pulling some of them ourselves." Clara nodded. "We've been blind for too long. If Reyes is as untouchable as this guy says, then we need to be smarter. We can't just barge in with guns blazing. We need to think 2 steps ahead of him." The man sitting in the chair, still bound by the restraints, looked up at us. "You think you can outsmart Reyes? He's already watching you." The venom in his voice made it clear that he didn't believe we stood a chance. And yet, his words only fueled my determination. If Reyes thought he could watch us, then it was time to make him look the other way. "We'll take every step cautiously," I said, my voice cutting through the doubt in the room. "But we won't stop. We get Reyes, we take down the whole network." The man shook his head slowly. "You think this is just about Reyes? It's bigger than him. Much bigger. He's just the face. The real power is in the shadows." "What do you mean?" Maxine asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "Reyes is the enforcer, the one who gets his hands dirty. But the real players, the ones who control everything, they never show their faces. They don't have to. They use people like Reyes to do their bidding." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "So, Reyes isn't the end of the line?" The man shook his head. "No. He's just the beginning. The ones at the top are untouchable, and if you think you can just tear down the empire by taking him down, you're wrong." There was no time to process the full extent of what he was saying. We were running out of time, and the only thing I knew for certain was that Reyes was the key. He might not be the highest power in the chain, but he was the one who had enough blood on his hands to make sure we never got close to the ones at the top. Maxine's eyes locked on the man. "You keep saying this like it matters. We're not here to play nice. We're not walking away from this." The man's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "Then good luck." I turned back to the rest of the team. "We need to start with his associates. If we can't find Reyes himself, we'll find those closest to him. Someone will slip up. Everyone does." Clara began typing furiously on her laptop, her fingers moving with practiced speed. "I'll dig into every connection, every lead. We need to know who Reyes trusts, who he's worked with in the past, and who's in his inner circle." "Maxine and I will hit the streets," Thomas said, already reaching for his coat. "We'll gather intel the old-fashioned way. We know enough people on the ground to start asking questions." I nodded. "We'll make sure nothing falls through the cracks. Everyone's part is critical now. The plan was set, but there was one thing still gnawing at me. We were walking into a storm, and Reyes wasn't just going to let us tear down his empire without a fight. I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. I took one last look at the man who had given us our first real lead. He was staring at me with cold, empty eyes, resigned to his fate. Whatever he had been a part of, it was clear he was finished. And yet, his words haunted me. The real power is in the shadows. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. We had a job to do. The shadows would come later. Right now, it was Reyes that needed to answer for the destruction he'd caused. Maxine, Clara, and Thomas all moved toward the door, preparing for the next phase of our operation. But I lingered a moment longer, the weight of the task before us pressing down on my shoulders. We get Reyes, I whispered to myself. And then we burn the rest to the ground. The cold night air hit my face as we stepped outside. The storm had let up, but the streets were still slick with rain. The city, alive and bustling in the daytime, seemed quieter now, more menacing. The glow of streetlights reflected off the puddles, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. Maxine, Clara, and Thomas were already on their phones, coordinating with contacts, arranging meetings, and preparing to track down every lead. I could feel the weight of what we were up against, the complexity of it all threatening to swallow us whole. But we couldn't stop. We couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. I turned to Clara, who was lost in her screen, her brows furrowed as she scrolled through the latest information on Reyes. How close are we? I asked, my voice low. She glanced up, her face etched with determination. I've found some connections. Reyes has ties to a number of high-profile figures, local politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement. But there's one person who stands out. A former associate of his, someone who's supposedly been out of the game for years. A woman. If we can find her, we might get the breakthrough we need. Maxine's sharp gaze met mine. If Reyes trusts her, she could be the key to getting to him. We find her, we find him. I nodded. All right. Let's track her down. Hours later. We had split up to cover more ground. Maxine and I headed to a seedy bar on the outskirts of the city where Reyes' associates were rumored to gather. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and smoke. I hated places like this, places where the truth was often hidden behind veils of secrecy and deception. But we had no choice. As we walked in, the low murmur of conversation came to a halt. Eyes followed us from every corner. It wasn't a place where people asked questions unless they were prepared for answers they didn't want. Maxine didn't flinch. She was in her element here, moving with the kind of confidence that said she belonged. I, on the other hand, was more cautious. My eyes scanned the room, noting the exits, the faces, the body language of the people around us. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were about to stir a hornet's nest. We made our way to the back, where a group of men sat around a table, a few of them looking up as we approached. Maxine gave a small nod, acknowledging their silent greetings, and I took a seat across from a man who looked like he'd seen too many battles. Looking for something? He asked, his voice gravelly, eyes bloodshot from years of too many late nights. We're looking for someone, Maxine said, leaning forward just enough to make her point clear without being too forward. Someone who used to work with Dominic Reyes. You know who I'm talking about. The man smirked, as if her question amused him. He took a long swig from his beer before answering. Everyone's always looking for Reyes. You know what happens to people who get too close to him. We're not afraid of Reyes, I said, cutting in. We're not here for him, we're here for her. He narrowed his eyes. Her. You don't mean Cassidy, do you? Maxine's expression hardened at the name, but she didn't show any other sign of recognition. I, on the other hand, felt a chill run down my spine. Cassidy. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it. I know where she is, the man said, his eyes shifting nervously. But you didn't hear it from me. Maxine didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, slamming it down on the table. You just did. Now, tell us where. The man glanced at the money, his resolve faltering. He hesitated for a moment longer before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been hiding out in the old warehouse district. North side of the city. You'll find her there. But I wouldn't go looking for trouble, if I were you. People who try to get close to her, they don't come back. Thanks for the tip, Maxine said coldly, pushing the money toward him. We didn't waste time with pleasantries. We were already out the door before the man could say another word. The warehouse district. The streets grew more desolate the farther we drove into the northern part of the city. The warehouse district was a maze of abandoned buildings, their windows boarded up, the ground littered with debris and forgotten remnants of the city's industrial past. Maxine parked the car a few blocks away, and we made our way on foot, moving cautiously through the shadows. The air felt thick, like the calm before the storm, and I could feel my pulse quicken with every step. We turned a corner, and there she was. Cassidy. She was standing in front of an old warehouse, her silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Her eyes locked onto mine as we approached, and I couldn't help but notice how she held herself, guarded, tense, as if she were waiting for something, or someone. You're looking for me, Cassidy said, her voice cool and steady. We need answers, Maxine replied, her tone matching Cassidy's in its no-nonsense directness. Cassidy tilted her head, studying us for a long moment. I don't owe you anything, she said flatly. But I'll give you something anyway. You're wasting your time chasing after Reyes. He's just a pawn. There are bigger things at play here. Things you won't be able to touch. I stepped closer. What do you mean? We're not here for a warning. We need to know how to bring him down. Cassidy's gaze shifted, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, fear, maybe, or regret. You don't understand. The game is much bigger than Reyes. If you're looking for answers, you'll have to dig deeper. But be careful. The more you dig, the harder it will be to escape. Maxine crossed her arms. And you're just going to leave us hanging? Cassidy looked away, her voice softening. You'll find your answers, but at a cost. She turned and began walking toward the warehouse, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, the weight of her words settling over me. Maxine exhaled slowly. That didn't give us much to work with. Maybe, I said, but it's a start.